on a quiet stretch of farmland near Ina, Illinois. The night of November 18, 1987, passed without sirens, without screams, without witnesses. The world slept peacefully, unaware that inside a modest white trailer, something unspeakable was unfolding. By morning, the Dardeen family had been erased. Inside the trailer lay Russell Dardeen, bludgeoned repeatedly with a baseball bat. Nearby was his wife, Jeannine, 7 months pregnant, beaten so violently that the force of the attack induced labor. Their newborn son never took a breath. And as if that cruelty were not enough, their 2-year-old son, Peter, was also brutally murdered. Nothing was stolen. There were no signs of forced entry. No neighbors heard a struggle. The crime scene defied logic. Excessive violence without an obvious motive, rage without explanation, and a level of brutality that seemed deeply personal. Yet no suspect was ever identified. No arrests were made. No convictions followed. Decades later, the Dardeen family murders remain unsolved, a case so disturbing that even seasoned investigators struggle to speak about it. And hauntingly, the most terrifying question remains unanswered. Who would do this, and why? Before their names became inseparable from one of the most horrifying unsolved crimes in American history, the Dardeens were simply a young family trying to build a quiet life. Russell Eugene Dardeen, just 29 years old in 1987, was known by friends and co-workers as polite, dependable, and soft-spoken. He worked as a computer technician for a local company, a job that required long hours and frequent travel, but one that he approached with diligence and responsibility. Russell was not flashy or outspoken. He was the kind of man people trusted instinctively, calm, courteous, and deeply devoted to his family. His wife, Jeannine Elizabeth Dardeen, was 30 and 7 months pregnant with their second child. Friends described her as warm, nurturing, and optimistic, even when life felt uncertain. She was a devoted mother to their 2-year-old son, Peter, and eagerly preparing for the arrival of their new baby. The couple lived modestly, not out of necessity alone, but out of preference. They didn't seek attention. They didn't court drama. Their happiness came from routine, family dinners, quiet evenings, and the anticipation of welcoming a new life into the world. In early 1987, the Dardeens had relocated to Jefferson County, Illinois, settling near the small rural community of Ina. Their home was a white mobile trailer set back from the road, surrounded by open land and farmland. It was peaceful, isolated, and seemingly safe, the kind of place where neighbors waved, doors were left unlocked, and violence felt distant, almost unimaginable. For Russell and Jeannine, it represented stability and hope, a place where they could raise their children away from chaos. But behind the appearance of normalcy, subtle tensions existed. Russell had reportedly expressed concerns to friends about a strange encounter months earlier. He claimed that someone had approached him, threatening him and attempting to extort money. The details were vague, and Russell himself seemed unsure whether the threat was serious or merely unsettling. Law enforcement was made aware, but no formal report ever produced a suspect. At the time, the incident faded into the background, strange, but not alarming enough to disrupt their lives. Jeannine, meanwhile, was focused on the future. She was nearing the final weeks of pregnancy, making preparations for the baby's arrival, arranging the trailer, and caring for Peter. There was no evidence of marital conflict, no signs of financial desperation, no known involvement with drugs, crime, or dangerous associates. By all outward measures, the Dardeens were an ordinary family with ordinary dreams. That ordinariness is what makes what happened next so deeply unsettling. On the evening of November 18, 1987, Russell returned home after work. There were no recorded arguments, no distress calls, no warnings. Sometime during the night, an unknown individual or individuals entered the trailer. Whether they were invited inside, already known to the family, or entered silently remains one of the case's greatest mysteries. By the time dawn arrived, the Dardeen family was gone, not just dead, but violently erased in a manner so extreme it defied comprehension. The peaceful life they had built ended in a nightmare of unimaginable brutality. leaving behind a crime scene that would shock investigators and confound experts for decades. They were not criminals. They were not hiding secrets known to the public. They were not living risky lives. They were a family. And that is what makes this case so profoundly disturbing. What happened inside the Dardeen family trailer during the night of November 18, 1987, remains one of the most horrifying reconstructions in American criminal history. There were no witnesses, no emergency calls, no cries heard across the open farmland. Whatever unfolded happened in silence, or close enough to it. Investigators believe the attack began shortly after Russell Dardeen returned home from work that evening. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting that the person responsible was either known to the family, let inside willingly, or entered without resistance. The trailer showed no indication of a struggle spilling outside. Everything occurred within those thin walls. Russell was likely the first victim. Evidence suggests he was struck repeatedly with a baseball bat, a weapon later found at the scene, broken from the sheer force of the blows. The injuries were catastrophic and immediate. The attack was not hurried. It was deliberate. Each strike carried a level of rage that went far beyond what was necessary to kill. Investigators would later describe the violence as excessive, personal, as if driven by something far deeper than robbery or impulse. Jeannine was next. 7 months pregnant. She was brutally beaten with the same weapon. The trauma was so severe that it forced her into labor. In the midst of the violence, she gave birth. The infant, a baby boy, was born alive but never had a chance to survive. He was left on the bed, wrapped only in tragedy. Another victim of a night that defied human understanding. The most haunting part of the crime came last. 2-year-old Peter Dardeen was not spared. After the adults were killed, after the bat had already done its terrible work, the attacker turned to a toddler. Peter was beaten and killed. His small body subjected to a level of violence that stunned even seasoned investigators. There was no evidence of restraint, no indication that mercy ever crossed the killer's mind. This was not collateral damage. It was intentional. Nothing was taken from the trailer. Money, personal belongings, and valuables were left untouched. The crime scene showed no signs of theft or vandalism. This was not a burglary gone wrong. It was not a random act of violence. Whatever the motive, it had nothing to do with material gain. When authorities discovered the scene the following day, the brutality overwhelmed even experienced law enforcement officers. Some would later say it was the worst crime they had ever encountered. The level of violence suggested hatred, obsession, or a psychological break so severe that it erased any trace of restraint. And yet, there was no clear suspect. No neighbors reported seeing anyone unusual. No unfamiliar vehicles were noticed in the area. No fingerprints or DNA evidence led to an arrest. The isolation of the trailer, once considered a blessing, had become a curse. The open farmland offered no witnesses, no cameras, no clues carried on city noise or streetlights. Investigators searched for connections: Russell's workplace, Jeannine's friendships, financial records, past conflicts. They revisited Russell's earlier claim that someone had threatened him, demanding money. Could the threat have been real? Could it have escalated into something far worse? Despite extensive questioning, no individual matching that description was ever found. The brutality itself became a puzzle. Crimes involving such extreme violence often point to someone with a personal connection, someone driven by rage, jealousy, or fixation. But no such person emerged. There were no known enemies, no affairs, no feuds, no criminal ties. The Dardeens had lived quietly, invisibly, until the moment they were violently erased. By the end of the investigation's early phase, law enforcement was left with more questions than answers. The scene offered horror, but not clarity. The motive remained elusive, the killer invisible. And as the days turned into weeks, and weeks into years, one truth became impossible to ignore. Whoever killed the Dardeen family walked away, and was never seen again. In the days following the discovery of the Dardeen Family Murders, law enforcement descended on the rural outskirts of Ina, Illinois. determined to make sense of a crime that seemed to defy every known pattern. State police, local deputies, and forensic teams examined the trailer inch by inch, searching for anything, a fingerprint, a footprint, a strand of hair, that could explain who committed such an atrocity and why. Almost immediately, investigators were confronted with a troubling reality. There was very little to work with. There were no signs of forced entry. Doors and windows were intact. No neighbors had reported suspicious activity. The baseball bat used in the killings belonged to the family, eliminating the possibility that the attacker had arrived armed. This suggested planning, familiarity, or both. Yet no known associate of the Dardeens fit the psychological profile implied by the violence. Russell Dardeen's earlier claim of being threatened became a focal point. Months before the murders, Russell had reportedly told friends and coworkers that an unknown man had approached him, demanding money and making vague threats. Investigators took this seriously, interviewing colleagues and retracing Russell's movements. But the description was inconsistent, and no one else had seen or encountered this individual. Without a name, a face, or corroboration, the lead slowly evaporated. Attention then turned inward. As disturbing as it was to consider, investigators had to rule out the possibility of a murder-suicide scenario. But the evidence did not support it. The sheer number of blows, the killing of the newborn after Jeannine had given birth, and the murder of Peter after the adults were already dead pointed clearly to an external perpetrator. This was not a moment of domestic rage spiraling out of control. It was something far darker. Serial offenders were considered next. The level of brutality, the lack of sexual assault, and the absence of theft made the crime highly unusual. Profilers debated whether the killer was motivated by obsession, anger, or a psychological compulsion unrelated to the victims themselves. Some suggested the possibility of a transient offender, someone passing through, capable of extreme violence, who vanished as quietly as they arrived. But without physical evidence or similar crimes nearby, the theory remained speculative. Another chilling possibility emerged. The killer may have known the family casually, but not intimately. Someone familiar enough to enter the trailer without resistance, yet distant enough to avoid suspicion afterward. A coworker? An acquaintance? Someone harboring a silent fixation? Investigators explored these angles, conducting interviews and background checks, but nothing solid surfaced. As weeks turned into months, momentum faded. Leads dried up. Forensic technology in the late 1980s was limited, and the evidence collected offered no definitive answers. The case began to cool, not because authorities stopped caring, but because the trail had simply gone cold. What made the failure even more unsettling was the absence of a narrative that made sense. Crimes this violent typically leave behind patterns, escalating behavior, prior threats, or similar attacks elsewhere. The Dardeen murders stood alone, an isolated eruption of unimaginable brutality with no clear origin and no identifiable aftermath. Over time, the case slipped into the category investigators dread most: unsolved but unforgettable. For the community of Ina, the murders shattered the illusion of rural safety. Doors were locked, porch lights stayed on, parents watched their children more closely, and for law enforcement, the Dardeen file became a reminder that sometimes even the most horrific crimes leave behind nothing but silence. No suspect was ever charged, no motive was ever confirmed, and no explanation ever fully emerged. The Dardeen family disappeared in a single night, and the person responsible disappeared with them. With no arrests, no definitive suspects, and no clear motive, the Dardeen family murders have lived on through theories, each attempting to impose logic on a crime that seems to resist it. Over the decades, investigators, criminologists, and true crime researchers have revisited the case, searching for patterns that might explain the unexplainable. One of the earliest theories centered on Russell Dardeen's alleged extortion threat. If someone had truly targeted him for money, the violence might have escalated beyond its original intent. But this theory collapses under scrutiny. Nothing was stolen. The brutality extended far beyond Russell. The killing of Jeannine, the newborn, and Peter suggests that eliminating witnesses, or something far more disturbing, was the goal. Extortion rarely ends in annihilation. Another theory suggests a crime of mistaken identity. Perhaps the attacker intended to target someone else, or believed Russell was someone he was not. But again, the prolonged and excessive violence argues against a quick, mistaken attack. This was not a hit gone wrong. It was sustained, intimate, and emotionally charged. Some have proposed the involvement of a serial killer or transient offender, someone capable of extreme violence, passing through rural Illinois without leaving a trace. While this theory accounts for the lack of suspects, it struggles to explain the personal nature of the attack. Serial offenders typically leave signatures or repeat behaviors. The Dardeen murders stand alone, unmatched in method or motive. Perhaps the most chilling theory is also the hardest to accept. The killer had no personal connection to the family at all. Instead, the Dardeens may have been victims of pure opportunity, selected because they were isolated, vulnerable, and unseen. In this scenario, the violence reflects the internal world of the attacker rather than anything about the victims themselves. It suggests a person driven by compulsion, not conflict, rage without reason. Yet even this explanation feels incomplete. Why stay so long? Why such extreme force? Why target a child last? These questions haunt the case because they imply intent beyond convenience. The sequence of events suggests awareness, control, and deliberation, not panic or impulse. Whoever committed the murders made choices, each one more disturbing than the last. The absence of sexual assault complicates profiling further. The lack of theft eliminates common motives. The silence of the night removes witnesses. Each missing element deepens the mystery instead of clarifying it. And then there is the greatest question of all. How does someone commit an act this violent and never strike again, or at least never be caught again? Some investigators believe the killer may have died, been incarcerated for an unrelated crime, or moved far away. Others fear something more unsettling, that the person responsible blended back into ordinary life, carrying the weight of that night silently, unnoticed. The Dardeen murders endure not just because of their brutality, but because they refuse resolution. They remind us that not all crimes end with answers, and not all evil announces itself before it strikes. For the families left behind, there is no closure. For the community, no peace. And for those who study the case, only the lingering dread of a truth that remains forever out of reach. More than 3 decades have passed since the night of November 18, 1987, yet the silence surrounding the Dardeen family murders remains unbroken. No arrests were made, no trials followed, no answers ever came. For lives, including one that never truly began, were erased in a manner so violent it still defies understanding. The Dardeens were not powerful. They were not infamous. They were not living on the edge of danger. They were ordinary people who believed they were safe, and perhaps that is what makes this case so unsettling. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, evil does not announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, leaves nothing behind, and vanishes forever. The questions remain unanswered. Was it personal or purely random? Was it someone they knew, or someone they never noticed at all? The Dardeen family deserved justice. Instead, they were left with mystery. And, until the truth is known, their story will continue to haunt the margins of American crime history. A reminder that not every nightmare ends with resolution. This is True Crime Vault 360, where the past speaks, the truth breathes, and the shadows never stay silent.